In the town of Poissy, just to the northwest of Paris, you'll find this building. It's the Villa Savoye. If you didn't look at it too closely, you might think it's just another modern building, that it was finished quite recently. In fact, it's been standing here since approximately 1929. And it is the building that maybe more than any other has defined the course that modern architecture was to take during the 20th century. It's the masterpiece of the Swiss architect Le Corbusier, perhaps the greatest architect who ever practiced. It is the original, and we still think it's the ultimate modern house. Looking at this building now, you might be forgiven for thinking that this is just yet another typical modern style building, but the importance of the building just can't be stressed enough. If you think about it, houses of the 19th century, early 20th century, if you wanted to make them important, if you wanted to give them architectural qualities, the way to do it was to build large rooms or to spend an awful lot of money on decoration or to make things that were very ornate. After the Villa Savoye, the language that was to form the international movement and the modern style had been set. We learned that the way to create important spaces was to use light, was to think about how we move through spaces, was to think about how geometry can create truly interesting spaces. The Villa Savoye was built as the weekend retreat of a wealthy Parisian couple. And one of the interesting things about it is that it incorporates for the very first time the 5 rules that Le Corbusier had established as being necessary in order for a house or for a building to be truly modern. First of all, that the house or the building should be on stilts so that the living accommodation was raised above ground. The inhabitants could enjoy the view, and also you could get away from that perennial problem we have in Northern Europe of damp. Second was that the structure of the house should be separate from the walls which form the spaces. That, in other words, you've got a structural system and then the walls can be placed precisely where you want your spaces to be created. The third was that you should have a roof garden. Technology was only beginning to allow this to happen, so it was a very novel idea. The fourth idea was that you would have this horizontal window so that you'd have these incredible views wherever you were standing within a building. And then the last one was that the facade should be free. It shouldn't be structural. It should be something that you could play around with. The house is arranged on 3 levels. You've got the point of entry, which is at ground level. You've got all of the living accommodation, which occurs on what he referred to as the piano nobile. And then we have the roof terrace, which is on the upper level. It's very easy to overlook the influence that this building has had on how we live in the early part of the 21st century. If you think about it, we're so used now to picking up magazines that show how people live in lofts and have fancy villas in the country and have roof gardens and terraces and ultra-contemporary furniture, but it all started here. This was the house that created this idea that you may have free-flowing space, that there would be this curious connection between the exterior terrace and the interior living space, that you'd have these very, very modern, very contemporary pieces of furniture that were designed specifically to fit into your room. If you look at it, the corp chaise longue, this is where it belongs, this is where it came from. Now it's in practically every loft apartment in every large city in the world. The Villa Savoye was completed on or around 1929, 1930. It continued to be used by the Savoye family as a weekend retreat until the late 30s, I believe. After that, there had been some structural problems, so the family didn't spend a great deal of time here. During the war years, it was used by the Germans, and then following them, the Americans. Then for a period in the 1950s, the land was expropriated by the local township, Poissy, who had decided to build a secondary school here. A campaign was waged to save the Villa Savoye from demolition, and in fact they were very close to demolition in March of 1959. Ultimately it became a listed structure in 1964, although it remained in poor condition. Attempts were made to restore the building during the 70s and 80s, but the most serious attempt at restoration began in 1997, when all of this money was spent and the villa was brought back to probably better than its original condition. I have to say that when I first came across the Villa Savoye as a student, I really didn't get it. I didn't get the house. I didn't get this concept of the house being a machine for living in. I grew up in a very modest sort of suburban environment, and we didn't live in machines. But now things have changed, and I think that increasingly people are exercising much more control over the environment, over the places in which they live. In some regards, houses now have actually become machines that work around our way of living, so that it might be said that the building has much more significance now than it did in 1929.